Hey Explorers, and welcome back to Pip Explores. This week we're talking about tents versus hammocks.
When you ain't got no money, you got
So there are a lot of pros and cons to both tents and hammocks. And so nobody on the internet yells at me. I camp in both. I love both. I'm just here to lay out some information. So let's dive in. So the first thing we're going to talk about is tents. And now, tents are inherently more familiar to a lot of people. This makes them easier. They're not necessarily in of themselves easier, but just because they're more familiar, it feels more intuitive, so it's easier to set up. And if you've never camped before, that's an easier thing for you to figure out than like an entire hammocking setup. Tents also have the added thing that they are easier to move around in. You got more space. You have this whole like little mini structure to call your home. Whereas when you're in a hammock, you have, your hammock area, but you're kind of still standing on the ground. It's a whole thing. So you have more room to move around. Additionally, tents are, again, just easier in an intuitive way to successfully stay dry when it's raining, especially if you have like a high quality tent with a bathtub floor and a nice long rain fly that's like made for this. Not that hammock campers get wet all the time. It just requires a little bit more skill to not get wet all the time. Additionally, if you're not used to camping and you go out into a tent, your tent actually feels like you're inside. Granted, you're still like in the great outdoors and all that, but the feeling you get in a tent feels like you're inside. Now, obviously, there are cons to anything. So what are the cons to tent camping? Well, number one, you have to sleep on the cold, hard ground. And I know a ton of people who just don't want to do that. On top of that, to put up a tent, you have to find a flat spot. And then you have to clear off that flat spot and you have to make sure there isn't a stick. Because if you miss one stick, it's going to end up right in the middle of your back all night. And no matter how you wiggle around, you're still going to have that stick in your back. Additionally, if weight is a concern of yours, tents are easier for them to be heavier. Not saying that every tent setup is heavier than every hammock setup, but it's easier to have a heavier tent than a heavier hammock. So what about hammocks? What's so great about those? Well, personally, I love hammocks because you're sleeping on the air. You have the support of your hammock, but you don't have to worry about the ground. The ground can be sopping wet and gross, and you're just floating above it. The only thing you need are trees, and hopefully, in the wilderness, there are trees. Hammock camping also makes you more in tune with nature. You can really feel like you're in the wilderness. Could be a pro, could be a con. Whatever. But that is a thing that happens when you hammock camp. You feel more exposed. Could be good, could be bad. Like I said when I was talking about tents, hammock camping is kind of easier to be lighter. It's easier to cut things that you might decide aren't important. Like, if you don't want a bug fly, you probably should. But you don't have to. And if you're really like trying to cut weight, you can use one of those like half bug flies that only covers like your top half because your bottom half's in sleeping quilts anyway. So like you have options and you can customize a hammock setup however you want it to be. So it gives you a little bit more freedom where tents are like, here's your tent. Granted, there are a lot of tents on the market, so you could probably find whatever you're looking for. Also, if you set up your hammock fly correctly every single time, you'll be dry every single time. It's a lot harder to set up a hammock correctly every single time, but it's possible, so you could be dry all of the time. One of the major cons for hammock camping is it only works when there are trees. I have not lived in a place in the last 4 years where I could set up my hammock easily. It's always a big production because the trees are just too far apart or they're too close together, and it's a whole thing. And imagine that that's you, and the only way you can sleep tonight is if you successfully find correctly distanced trees. Now, there's a lot of things you can do to make up for that, but still, could be something to consider, especially if you're, hiking through a desert or an area with no trees. Maybe don't take a hammock then. Not your best bet. Another con that not a lot of people think about is How do you change your clothes when you hammock camp? You can either not care about anybody around you, which is fine if you're backpacking and you're in the middle of the wilderness and there's nobody around you. But if you're at a family campground, how are you changing your clothes? Typically, you're going to want to stand under your fly, but depending on the shape of your fly and how long it is and all of these other things, which granted, if you buy a very nice or make a nice hammock fly, it should provide enough coverage. You are going to have to stand on the dirty ground while doing this, but I digress. So that's just another thing to think about. How are you going to change your clothes? Did you buy a clear hammock fly because you wanted to see the stars and are now realizing that your business is everywhere? Could be an issue. Now, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what you choose to camp in. Again, I have so many of both hammocks and tents, and I love both. I love having the options. But these are things you need to consider when you're maybe first time, okay, what am I buying? Or on every trip, what is practical for my situation? Why am I choosing this? Personally, if I can, I'm going to hammock camp. But I don't have a winter hammock camping setup. So if I'm camping in January, I'm going to take my tent. So that's all we have for this week. When you go camping, do you prefer a hammock or a tent? Let me know in the comments below. If you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all at Piff Explores. Don't forget to check out the website, piffexplores.com, and we will see you next week. Bye, guys.